Okay, we're rolling. So, greetings, world. What am I going to call this? Let's call this, I've been calling this spiritual judo in the past. Jesus' legacy is the legacy theory, legacy theology. Legacy theology for interfaith Christianity might be one way to talk about what I'm doing. So legacy theology, it's beyond science, right? It's to get back and contextualize science, put science in its proper perspective. So legacy theory, or legacy theology, legacy theology for multidisciplinary philosophy kind of gets at most of it. So starting with context today for progressive Christianity as well. So this is a portrait of Phyllis Wheatley to start us off. And my name is Marg Monteiro. Howdy. And coming to you from Brazil, New York City was my longtime training ground, stomping ground, home court. And now I'm in Iguape, Ceará, Brazil. And today we're taking a look at this portrait of Phyllis Wheatley. Somebody posted this, and it's a fascinating and wonderful story. Phyllis Wheatley, credited as the first African-American poet in a sad situation of her life, unfortunately, sad because of such promise and such development of her poetic skills and talents. So let's see here. Phyllis Wheatley was born in around 1753 in Africa, enslaved there around 7 years old, and brought to Massachusetts, and bought by a guy named John Wheatley, a merchant, a successful merchant, and his wife Susanna. And with their kids Mary and Nathaniel, they began to educate the woman Phyllis Wheatley, whose first name Phyllis comes from her slave ship. Strangely, they kept that name, and Wheatley, is the last name of the family. So the kids, at least, were heavily involved in educating Phyllis, and she was already literate in Greek and Latin by age 12, able to read it, and by age 20 had books of poetry, and went to London with Nathaniel for her health and for exposure. And so regarding her skills, her literary skills. And so in 1773, the book was published in London, funded by a countess, Selina Hastings. And so with the publishing of that book, the Wheatleys emancipated Phyllis. And then a series of tragedies occurred. In 1774, Susanna died. 4 years later, John, the merchant, so that Phyllis herself was left without their sort of their contact and their support. Now, she married a free black man working as a grocer, John Peters, but his, there goes that image. All right, so let's turn this back to me. But John Peters ran into the difficulties of the financial system, and with debts, he was thrown into prison, debt prison, in 1784. And so there were a number of difficulties. Let me turn on the light. Here, shed some light on the subject. And And so that was the beginning of the end, basically. Sadly, Phyllis Wheatley had to get work as a maid. The situation wasn't a thriving one. And she had, their 3 babies had not survived. And so, it's just a sad story in that respect. But of course, it was wonderful that Phyllis, her talents were at least published, and her thoughts, her talents and thoughts were developed enough that she is quite an accomplished poet. And if I can get the material back here, I'd like to read some of that. But in recognizing Phyllis in this account, there's a historiography that's involved in terms of her basic situation. But then there's, and I was used to my secular life with my spiritual path, sort of part of my own experience. Looking at it from the outside a little bit, and treating secular culture and historiography basically, and honoring a person like Phyllis and getting sad at that situation, that was all transformed for me. It has been transformed for me as I've developed the idea of legacy theory. It's, I guess, legacy theology, and I guess I'm also calling it integrity theology. Legacy, integrity theology, integrity, legacy theology. All of these 2 elements which connect modern culture back to the key point that is Jesus. Instead of the doctrines and the doctrinal kind of judgmentalism and warfare that goes on, particularly outside of progressive Christianity. And then to be able to, using that to reclaim Jesus, who was no fundamentalist, Jesus who was no hate depraved fundamentalist, relying on doctrines that his blood had saved us and so that we must be club members. But rather he was somebody who had taught spiritual practice for practicing love, loving thy neighbor as thyself, commandment number 2, and thereby loving God. With Jesus's crucifixion, his suffering, his resurrection, then a justification of the meaning of and the significance of his healing teachings, that love heals isn't just an abstraction. It is, in fact, a reference back to Jesus's standard. And now we face the modern condition in which the rich have been funding the fundamentalists, right? The rich fund the fundamentalists, and that connection has been developed so that they don't question. The fundamentalists are reactionaries who don't question the rich, and they in fact try to justify the existence of the poor and smear. And then we have, of course, the smearing of people questioning the rich and advocating pro-social, pro-poor policies. So looking at Phyllis Wheatley then, and this, of course, takes off treating Marx as both having insights in terms of exploitation, the idea of exploitation, the idea of alienation, but also recognizing his limitations, that Marx was a materialist. In his negation of religion, Marx was simply fallacious. It's a fallacy that to dismiss an entire, what is in fact a fundamental operating. It's how humans live. It is a fundamental part of our life and our nature to be religious. It is part of our relational and our intellectual manner of relating to the universe. Now, in particular, in this modernized Christianized form of modern philosophy, using philosophy to reason and to be able to then justify and explain also spiritual religious experience. And so that comes, I like to look at that in case studies, and we can look at that here with Phyllis Wheatley. because her context is not just her alone. I mean, the sadness of her situation becomes even amplified when we look at the more fulfilling experience of people like Olaudah Equiano, who was an African who had been owned by a Quaker and was able to negotiate and buy his freedom from that Quaker, and then became involved in England, in London, having published his own book. He became involved with the abolitionists who were developing at that time. Very interesting group. And so that would be a group that then derives from George Fox. George Fox, as the founder of the Quaker-Friends back in the 1650s, starting around then, George Fox seems to have been the leading influence with his very interesting spiritual reflecting as he grew up without much education there in the United Kingdom, slightly north of London, as the son of some kind of merchant, of a wool merchant. And then his streamlining of doctrines, of course, and to give credit where it's due, in the Protestant Reformation, following Luther's inspiration, and then the English Reformation following that whole context. And so George Fox then, with his very spiritual concept of the inner light, the silent worship of God, waiting for God and listening for him in a very meditative way in the social context, and with Marg Fell as well, one of the other 59 of the 60 co-founders, very interesting, very generous crediting of giving of credit for the founding of the Quakers there. So George Fox in particular is known for refusing to bow to aristocrats, for protesting unjust sentences, unjust criminal sentences, and then ultimately in his marriage to Marg Fell, who was a pro-woman writer as a Quaker there. And so then their legacy then, 100 years later about, in the 1780s, had included an increasing agitation, I want to say, agitation and advocacy of anti-slavery messages in the United Kingdom in particular, well, also in the United States, in the North American colonies at that point, depending, and then the 1780s, right? So that's the United States is already independent, just getting on its feet, about to get its constitutional convention. And in the United Kingdom, there's this whole story of Thomas Clarkson. You know, many thanks to Adam Hochschild for his excellent book, Bury the Chains. And so then Thomas Clarkson was a young graduate from the university or college where he, as a dissident Anglican, right? So from the mainstream church and that social class, that socioeconomic class, he then found himself in comfortable acquaintance with Quakers. Very interesting story of how that developed. Okay, here we go. Here's Phyllis Wheatley's image. I'll turn back there. And so Thomas Clarkson then found his galvanizing context, the catalytic context that catalyzed him, that galvanized him to become a leader of the social movement. He had the orientation that the Quakers didn't quite have, an interesting sociological kind of phenomenon, but they supported him. They became the anchor. They became his inspiration. And he then led the social movement, organizing, meeting with people, traveling all over the country there in England, moving up to Manchester and visiting Bristol on the coast, doing research, organizing petitions, organizing boycotts, listening to ideas, and so on. So wonderful context there in the abolition movement. And then, of course, that there were parallels already in the United States. Tom Paine was actually the son of a Quaker or Quakers, and he had written against slavery in the 1770s already in Pennsylvania there, a Quaker country. Ben Franklin also, based in Quaker country then, also participated with an organizing group led by Quakers. Ibn Izay, a French descended English who had been in England, a French, I believe he was born in France, and then he resettled to England and then moved over to the North American colonies, had done some teaching of African Americans there in Philadelphia or Pennsylvania. And later, after in around 1800, 1810, 1820, Lucretia Mott, as a Quaker woman with her husband, was very active and in contact with African Americans also, like Marg Forten, daughter of a free black, successful free black there. And so, I mean, all these contexts, Benjamin Banneker, also African American guy, interesting accomplishments like almanacs and similar things. And then, of course, later, a little bit later, Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, interesting stories that in which they had more support and sort of at least illuminate a little bit more of the developments that came along even before full or as emancipation progressed, right, in the North, in the U.S. North, and in the United Kingdom. And so then, among the various issues of social movements, then the rise of the social gospel movement in the United States with Washington Gladden, Walter Rauschenbusch, and Jane Addams and others, but in particular them linking then to and providing foundations for the Roosevelts, right? Eleanor Roosevelt with the Jane Addams settlement houses, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt in his high school with what was the name of his principal and headmaster there in Boston. He was based in Boston for school and did some mission projects in that spirit. And so, of course, that's what then leads to the United Nations, right? Eleanor Roosevelt actually was very pro-African American. I was very interested to read about that a little bit. And that complemented very nicely, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's own efforts in the New Deal, with the Depression, investigating Wall Street's crimes, and coming up with legislation to deal with the problem of the Wall Street crash from speculating investors, and then preparation for the war at the same time, preparation to deal with Nazism and Japanese Tojo militarism, and then the United Nations, right? The vision for replacing the League of Nations with the United Nations and a human rights approach that Eleanor herself then was able to facilitate in Franklin's, after Franklin had died, had passed away, and his legacy administration with Truman and so on was and moving forward with that United Nations initiative, and Eleanor then with the human rights, making that interesting combination that from the Christian, as a spiritual perspective, then we have the Christian initiative in the social gospel by those two, and then representing this claim and this issue that is that, well, the golden rule exists throughout all cultures in humanity. And so then we have the balance of the initiative by the formal, divinely related and inspired golden rule in Christian culture and religion, in Jesus's legacy of loving integrity, and how that gets then negotiated with the rest of the world in a pluralist context. And it's then the negotiation that results in the United Nations with its human rights agreements. This wonderful, complex synthesis of these factors. Right, and so we have this wonderful example then that now that in Christianity's own deviations and distortions of its own, of Jesus's legacy, that isn't simply, of course, integrity, but is full of hypocrisy, full of church doctrines, authoritative issues, and distortions. And now that we get the feedback from the other cultures and religious traditions and relationships to God, right? Muhammad Yunus from the Muslim Bangladesh then has the Grameen Bank, pro-poor, pro-women, that's gone all through Bangladesh and diversified it to some 24 different units, other projects, and is up to 19 branches in the United States itself. Pro-poor banking, pro-women banking. Vandana Shiva is another example from India, an ex-physicist, or a physicist using her talents as an activist. And Wangari Maathai, the late activist from Africa, Kenya, and her actions. And I wanted to look up somebody in fair trade for Africa and the world, and how that advances the cooperative business model and sustainability. But that's progressive Christianity. So that's all larger context to help honor and remember Phyllis Wheatley, recognize her, honor her accomplishment as an African enslaved woman. Oh, I guess another issue is to recognize that, well, slavery actually is a human institution that has been in all cultures. To take off a little bit of that edge, but of course not to serve as any excuses for any of the atrocious behaviors that have gone on. But then to use that to be able to recognize the issue of socioeconomic models, socioeconomic orientation, and the problem of inequality and injustice, socioeconomic inequality and injustice, and then to contextualize that more fully in legacy theology and multidisciplinary philosophy, to include science, include empiricism, and understand Jesus' legacy in the university-based system that is now the UN-based UN human rights system, and all the rest, the globalized system then that has its issues of integrity and hypocrisy directly in relationship to Jesus, right? So that's the progressive Christianity that I'm supporting. It's basically just continuing and deepening the support for other existing groups, and I want to honor them. So thanks. Stay blessed in divine love through Jesus and pluralistic religion in the UN human rights spirit. And we'll see you next time. Take it easy. Bye-bye.